Hello, welcome to DSL 740 Technical in Organizations. So we're going to be talking about IT stuff again. That's what this class is all about. I'm going to take a little different slant at it though, because there is much more to managing IT than just managing the machines. You have to manage people. As soon as you introduce people into the equation, they are so variable that they're liable to mess things up. So I want to talk about that today and work our way through some thoughts along those lines. Did you know that currently there are 5 different generations working in ministries and nonprofits and for-profits for that matter? Not as much, because some of the older generations, all the way back to the silence, are very old at this point, but still serving in some ministries and some nonprofits. Non-standard tech, a lot of nonprofits and ministries will try to get by with whatever they can possibly afford, and sometimes that works. It works well enough to get them used to having the IT available to them, but then because it's either cheap or substandard, it breaks and really makes a mess. So we want to talk about budgeting, but we want to talk about budgeting through the lens of the 5 generations. Why is that important? Because each one of the generations has a different relationship to how they interact with technical or IT or computers. If you were looking at the oldest generation, the silence, and I'm not going to go through and break down the age groups for each one of these. I'm just going to talk about the silence, being the older generations, which would be 60, 70-year-old individuals. They're finishing as the topmost leaders in the organization. Maybe they were the original owner, maybe they were brought in and they've been there several years as the CEO or president. They're starting to finish in their roles. Some of them are having to come back in, and when they thought they were quitting, but they're not, because of a false summit. The false summit being, hey, I get to retire when I'm 65, and then I find out how much health care is, and I can't retire, so I got to come back in again, or I got to keep my job. So you see a lot of them either re-entering the workforce, trying to find a niche that they can fill, or staying in their current roles, which is causing a log jam behind them in the process of the normal flow of people, the generations as they climb the ladder. Boomers are moving into the senior roles. They're taking the places of the CEOs, and they're doing a pretty good job of that. For the most part, they're trying to keep up with technology, and they're engaged in it. They're relatively decent with technology, although not as good as younger generations, but they're trying to keep up, whereas the silence just gave up. They didn't try to keep up. They didn't really want to be bothered. They wanted somebody else to do IT for them. So they can work a phone, they can work a camera, they might be able to work a PC to some extent, but for the most part they can't. Boomers are trying to keep up. Generation Xers are moving into fewer of the senior level spots, and they're doing much more to keep up. They're a little bit younger, and they're able to adapt to some of the IT changes that are happening so quickly. Millennials are climbing the ladder quickly because they have such a fresh, new perspective of things. They're actually moving around Xers and around Boomers and taking some of those senior positions. But they are very good with IT. It's almost breathing to them. They didn't grow up with it really young with IT. It was just starting to make a splash when they came in the 1982 to 2000 ranges, when they would have been born. So it's gotten much better, and they're much more adept at it than Boomers or Xers, but they're not as good as Generation Z. Generation Z is starting to become defined. It hasn't become defined completely yet, but one of the things they note about Generation Z is they've never been without technology. They've always had technology. They've always had access to the internet. So when you're talking about in an IT setting, you have these different generations interacting with computers and IT differently. What you start to realize is some of us, I'm a boomer for one of them, Boomers and silence, we know other ways to do things other than with technology. Sometimes in a power outage situation or a broken phone or a broken computer situation, the younger generations are stymied. They don't know how to do research outside of using technology and just doing a Siri, hey Siri, tell me this, and Siri goes and finds it for them. They're not even really aware of how to run how to use a library properly. It's kind of funny when you think about it, because I grew up in a library researching or reading books. Each of generations has a different relationship, as I said earlier, with technology. Silents are not comfortable with tech. They don't see the need for it always. They'll find other ways to do things. They'll walk around with a legal pad and be making notes on paper, and versus everybody else walking around with their smart devices recording things on the fly. They're falling behind and they're slowing the progress down. The pipeline of growth through an organization as the generations move up into the different positions is stalled right now, and the transition of those silents out into to leave spaces behind for the senior positions is slowing down considerably. Boomers are struggling to keep up. They're a quick study though, and very fast. I learned things pretty quickly. Like I said, I went to DeVry, but a lot of what I learned at DeVry at the end of the day doesn't really apply to modern computers any longer, and it's kind of sad. I know things that don't really matter. Generation X, useful and confident in their usage. You hand them a new technology or a new software package and they'll figure it out, and they're really good at figuring it out, and they move pretty quick doing it, but they still know other ways to do things besides with technology because we've had to. Millennials, comfortable, confident, reliant on, able to choose when in IT or in apps are needed. So at this point, millennials have grown into a maturity level where they can look over the organization and say, maybe this type of technology is not the best. It's cutting edge and everything, but it's maybe not the best answer for this problem. Maybe we should do it this way. And they might introduce into it hybrid solutions that combine together the way I used to do things in a paper world versus the way they do things in a computer. They bring those two together and make an even better solution. Millennials are phenomenal at that. Gen Z is absolutely fearless about technology. You hand them anything and they'll just figure it out. They don't have to read a manual necessarily. They're unable to work without it. You take it all away from them, they'll sit there with no idea what to do next. So that part's a little bit troublesome, and we'll have to grow them through that as they mature in their positions. Gen Z needs continuous access to technology, whether it's feedback mechanisms or it's updating or it's research-based. They need full access to IT at all times. So when they talk about IT, or when you try to budget for their IT needs, they're looking for the latest and greatest of everything, not the least bit afraid of it. And they're going to push you to buy things or experiment with things or research things that you wouldn't have done before, because they'll help you understand how to use it. So that's what I want to talk about as we're trying to talk about budgeting is how do we budget in an environment where we have multiple generations, each one of them interacting with IT differently. That changes the equation on how we should look at through the lens of our budgeting process to make sure that we're accounting for all those different needs and requirements. As an IT leadership, a question you need to consider as you budget is this very simply: which generation do you aim for as you budget for IT? Which generation? So which of the 5 generations are you pointing? Are you looking at saying, okay, I got to address these needs specifically because of this generation? Which means, of course, that it's budget being a finite thing, income being a finite thing. You probably don't have money to be able to cover all the generations equally. So some of the generations are going to be pushed off to the side. What is making this an issue? Because each generation uses tech differently. They're going to be asking for different things. They're going to be different for access levels, access all hours of the day and night, 7 days a week. A lot of Gen Z people do things at 2 o'clock in the morning. They'll sit down and they'll do some programming, or they'll do some updating, or check emails or whatever. They'll do it so late at night, whereas boomers like me, I go to bed early and I don't wake up till early the next morning. I fit my workday into normal hours, so normal access times are perfect for me in an IT environment. You can take it down during the middle of the night and upgrade something or fix something that requires the system to be down, because I won't be using it in the middle of the night. That's not true of the younger generations. They'll actually be using it all throughout the night. So that introduces additional stress and strain in trying to plan and schedule things. So each generation in the relationship with tech, if you aim for the silent generation, your dollars are going to be devoted to stabilization, training, and general apps like Office, all the Office suite products, or a specific database they might use for their industry. So when you're thinking about how you got to delegate money when you're talking about silence, it's going to be the stabilization. You're going to be continually looking at the network, looking at the pieces, saying, okay, that piece is getting a little dusty. I'm going to have to replace it pretty soon and get a new device in there to update it, make it more stable. So they're not looking for a Ferrari. They're looking for a good, dependable Volkswagen. It's going to get them from point A to point B. It doesn't cost $1 million to do it, but it's very consistent and very reliable. That's what they're going to be mostly focused on from a silent perspective. As you're planning your budget and you start thinking about boomers, boomers are updating infrastructure, so they're looking the width and breadth of the network to make sure it's stable, fast, accessible, backed up. All these, you want multiple paths for data to travel. In case this path goes down, this path will be available. It might be slower, might be different, but at least it's available. Making things easier and training. They need to be trained on these software packages. I was blessed with the ability, I can generally sit down with a software package, start fiddling with it, and I'll figure it out after a while. That's not always true of the older generations. They'll get real stymied by something. Generation Xers, they need new services, fresh training, updates, and security. Security with one exclamation point. They want it to be secure. They want it to be a safe environment. They certainly don't want their identity stolen. So that's more the focus when we're talking about Xers. Everybody doesn't want their identity stolen, but Xers are very self-reliant, very dependent on themselves. They don't like to have to rely on other people or other things to help them. They control things themselves. Millennials, new tech, new apps, artificial intelligence, updates, security with 2 exclamation points. Because the millennials use the internet so much, you got to make sure that it's safe for them and it isn't going to be an issue with security issue, because they're often an area they shouldn't be in that should protect them from that. But new tech, new apps, and the new thought is this artificial intelligence. Millennials are not as concerned about that as maybe us older boomers who have been around the block a little bit and seen things go horribly awry, kind of concerned about that. And I watched Terminator when it first came out, and it scared the heck out of me. So I think about AI in those terms. I'm probably just a little bit paranoid. The last one is Z. Z wants the cutting edge technology. They want the latest, greatest of everything. They are totally into the AI world, and you need to put security in with 3 exclamation points, because they're going to be off visiting different places, experimenting, researching, poking around in the internet in places they probably should be careful about. So that's your relationship, and that's how you would plan your budgeting process. And you can tell from the list I just gave you that there's a lot of different considerations and expectations involved. So let's make sure that we're accounting for all those as we plan our budget. So if you look at a timeline, and if you look at one side of the timeline has the silence on it, and the other side of the timeline has the millennial or Gen Z on it, you've got these generations in between. And you're coming back to that question I asked you a second ago, and I want you to think about a little bit. What generation do you aim for when you're planning your budget? The simple answer or the quick answer is all of them. Well, it's not practical. It doesn't work that way. You can't service all of them equally because you have finite resources. So you're trying to figure out on that timeline between the different generations, where do I aim my resources? Where do I aim my budgeting philosophy? And quite honestly, where you aim it is probably not where you think. So I'm going to take you through a quick thought process just to keep in mind. And I'll apologize ahead of time if you're offended by the lingo around guns, but I find this is the best way to explain it. If you take a sniper, and a sniper has 1 bullet, and they can aim that with a huge amount of accuracy anywhere and shoot somebody and hit them in the shoulder. They can do that from a distance, and a sniper is very, very effective with 1 bullet. If you take and aimed at boomers only, and aimed all your resources and 1 bullet at boomers, you would take off a chunk of that and address a lot of their expectations and needs, but you wouldn't be touching any of the other generations. Nobody else would get anything because you put all your resources and all your focus on 1 generation only. If you took a machine gun, and say a semi-automatic or machine gun, it peppers the bullets all around a different area. It's not very accurate. It kind of scatters them around a little bit, but the purpose of a machine gun is to throw a lot of lead at something and knock it out. If you do that, you could look at the timeline between the silence and the Gen Zs, and you could take your machine gun and you could pepper an area like, let's aim at the Xers and the millennials. And if we aim at those, we'll catch some of the outside edges because the bullets stray a little bit, but we're going to get a little bit better spread of our resources. We're going to use them in more places. The last one is a shotgun, and if you're not aware of what a shotgun does, a shotgun has a cartridge with a lot of little BBs in it, and you shoot it and they scatter everywhere. It's how you can hit a bird flying through the air, is with all these little BBs. If you take your shotgun and you aimed it, let's say, at millennials, you would get a lot of impact on millennials, but you would get a lot of impact around it. You would get all the generations would be touched to some extent or another. Not as much as the millennials, but you would definitely get the rest of the generations covered as well. So that's kind of a crude way of explaining it, but what I'm saying to you at the end of the day is don't aim at just one area unless that's what you're doing. Maybe your organization is completely made up of boomers, boomer technicians, boomer leadership, everybody's boomer. Then by all means aim your resources at the boomers only. Most organizations are unfortunate to be all one generation. They have the generations accounted for. If you aimed at the millennials, which kind of splits the difference between the boomers and the Gen Z, I'm pushing the silence off because they're not interested in technology anyways. But if you aimed right at the millennials, you're going to get everybody else as well. There's another way to look at that, and it has to do with a series of concentric circles. So if you look at the center, I would aim, or I submit to you for consideration, my philosophy around budgeting would be to aim at the millennials. If you aim at the millennials or the Gen Z, if you got some Gen Z in your organization, aim at them. All the stuff you purchase will serve all the rest of the generations. So as you move from the innermost circle of Gen Z, then you got the millennials, then you got the boomers, and you got the silents. By the time you get to the silents, you're not investing quite as much resources, but you're still covering the ones previous to it. And if you can picture in your mind a stack of wine glasses, all stacked up in a pyramid shape, if you start pouring water into the topmost wine glass, it fills that glass and then overflows and fills the next level, and overflows, and all the way down until it fills all the glasses, starting from the top down. That's what I'm saying when I'm saying aim your resources at the most current generations, and all the rest of the generations will benefit from it. But you want to keep feeding the people who have all the creativity and all this new sense and confidence around technology. You want to keep feeding them with as much resources as possible, because they're going to take you to the next level. So a couple other considerations and variables as you're doing this. Focusing on the most technical of the generations covers the ones most likely to use it profitably. I could take and hand boomers all kinds of AI and all kinds of security and all kinds of tools and applications to use, and they will do their best to use a lot of it. Being a boomer myself, sometimes I can't use all the technology that's available to me. I don't understand it, or I know another way to do it. It's really quick. I can get it done, and I don't have to mess with all that technology. Aiming at Gen Z and millennials, they're going to use technology. They're going to use every bit you give them and ask for more. Aim at them, and everybody downstream of them, Xers, boomers, and silents, will benefit from what you come up with. The new technology washes downward and impacts the ones willing and able to use it. So it'll seek its own level. Maybe you'll get as far as the Xers, and the boomers will say, that's great, all you guys use that, we're going to continue doing this way. Don't spend any money on us, in other words, spend it on the younger generations. There is visible and invisible technology like infrastructure and support software. I'm not talking about that as much in our discussion. And in the exercise you're going to do in a few minutes, it really doesn't cover that topic. But there is a lot of parts of technology and infrastructure that's invisible. The user doesn't see it, but they're supported by it. They just don't realize it. That's the way IT needs to be at a certain level. And then the part where the individual touches the keyboard and interacts with the software, that stuff has to be flawless. If it's backed up by the right infrastructure, it will be. There is technology that has nothing to do with the generations that's common to all. So email, Microsoft Word, there are certain technologies that everybody uses and they don't think anything of it. That's common to all. I'm talking about specialty applications, specialty usages that a generation will look at differently than the one after them or previous to them. And then lastly, how do you overcome the issue of upgrades appearing to be perks that are being rewarded? So let's say you plan your budget and a lot of the money goes to millennials and Gen Z, and Xers and boomers are sitting there thinking, I didn't get any resource. What happened here? What's going on? And you say, we're not rewarding or giving perks. We're installing IT infrastructure or software applications that'll serve the entire organization. We're just aiming at this group because they can use it more than everybody else. Sometimes people will either accept that, sometimes they won't. And at the end of the day, you need to do what's right for the organization. And what's right for the organization is to aim for the younger generations who are going to use the technology and the softwares and stuff that you give them. So we're going to head into a time of using a little tool to practice what we've been talking about. going to get passed out, and we can also email to you a digital version of this. It's a spreadsheet with all the different applications, services, support, training, everything, and it's meant to be a budget. It's a basic budget for a good-sized IT environment. It'll explain it to you in the explanation. But what I want you to do is I'd like you to go through and create a budget for the boomers and a budget for the millennials. Two separate budgets. I filled one out completely that's meant to be a generic 5-generation budget. I want you to create one that's focused more at boomers and more at millennials and see what the difference would be between them. Let me give you a little hint ahead of time. It's not so much the purchase of things as it is the presentation of things. So training, access, support, all these kind of things are what the main focus should be when you look at the difference between the generations. Dive into that. We'll talk about it when you come back in a couple minutes, and we'll see where we go from there. Hope this has been helpful. If it hasn't, email me. If I said something that left you questioning, by all means, email me. I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. Have a good time with the exercise, and thanks for joining the class. Goodbye.